Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Let's get started. As Stephen said, we want to make this as much about you guys as anything. So ask as many questions as you can and want, and we'll get through them. And with that said, I'm going to ask the panelists to turn their videos on, and would love to get them to introduce themselves. Let's start with Beth. Beth, thank you for joining us. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your background and the work you do?
Sure, thank you for inviting me. I just will say that I've been spending more time in the backyard on the trampoline with my kids in the last 10 weeks. And I'm the founder of a company called Ascended Tour based in Toronto. And broadly speaking, my company provides HR and organizational development consulting to private companies and in the not-for-profit sector. So more specifically, some of my core services are things like executive coaching, customized leadership development, doing things like learning and workshops for managers. And I also do non-clinical psychometric testing and assessment. I work across all levels. So I work with boards, I work with founders and management teams. And for me, what I really love about the work that I do is I have an opportunity to work with individuals and organizations and help them thrive. And when people are thriving and when organizations are thriving, they have an opportunity to realize their full potential. The topics that I'm interested in, I mean, this is such an interesting topic today, and it really dovetails with many of my interests. I'm very interested in building positive psychological constructs in the workplace, kindness and empathy at work, which is so important right now, concepts like psychological safety, how to build psychological capital in organizations, and how to build inclusive cultures. So today, again, really resonates for me, and thank you again for the opportunity to contribute. And my training's in psychology and business and HR. And I also work part-time as a professor. I teach courses like organizational behavior and coaching for effective performance management. That's a bit about me.
Love it. Thank you for joining us, Beth. We're very excited to have you here. Mark, thank you for your time. You have a really nice background over there. I like that wooden clock at the back. Can you tell the audience a bit about your background and the work you do?
Not my background. You're thinking
yeah, you
background.
Can tell us about that clock.
Well.
I'd love to know where you got it.
Yeah, you'll see I'm a Manchester United fan, so that's something to.
The same.
Oh, good. That can always go one of two ways: either alienate the audience or befriend the audience. So please do it that way.
Liverpool, we'd have to end this right here. So
yeah, exactly. And likewise, I would be closing down right now as well. So, we've probably alienated some of the audience. It's football we're talking about, Asad, not soccer. Let's be clear. So Mark, Edgar, really great to be here. Thank you very much again for the opportunity. Great to be joined by esteemed panelists like Beth and good friend Rob. So great to be here. So my name is Mark Edgar. I like to see myself as being a recovering CHRO. So I spent most of my career in HR, the last kind of 28 years or so. Just coming up to a 12-month anniversary of having left the corporate world, similar to Beth, now taking a leap into the world of entrepreneurial, being an entrepreneur, let's say, get my words out. So I've been doing that for the last 12 months. So I run a business called Goat Rodeo Project, which is my own business. For those of you who aren't familiar, and it apparently is most of the world, a goat rodeo represents a situation that's going to become a complete train wreck. So the idea of Goat Rodeo Project is that I help organizations predict and avoid train wrecks. So my passions are really around the intersection between HR and the future of work. So another thing I do is co-founder of an organization called Future Forward, which is all about supporting people, particularly in HR, to think about the future of work and how that intersects with HR. So helping organizations, similar word to Beth, kind of thrive in the future is a big passion of mine, and great to be here.
Love it. Thank you for being here. Very excited to have you on the panel. Rob, last but not least, I'm so happy that we get to do something together. Can you tell the audience a bit about WorkTango, yourself, the work you do?
Sure, yeah, really quickly. And I hate going after Mark because his accent is so awesome, but now I got to live up to that. But Rob Catalano, currently the Chief Engagement Officer at WorkTango. I've spent the last 17 years just building HR technology companies or consulting folks in the world of building a better workplace experience. I mean, what I'm passionate about sits on my t-shirt. When we built the organization, we said we don't have a mission statement because missions end. We have a passion statement. That's to improve work lives. It works in parentheses because we spend a lot of our waking time there anyway. So I love being part of these conversations. Usually I'm on your side, Assad, kind of leading the conversation. So what I'm starting to do new in this pandemic is be on the other side and do these panels. But excited to dive into the conversation today.
Love it. Thank you for doing this. I was talking to Stephen about doing this, and I was like, I need Rob on the panel. So I'm excited that you're here. Okay, let's jump into this, guys. Mark, I want to start with you. So as a society, we're going through this global pandemic. There's a movement for racial justice that's going on as well. And both of these things require a strong and good organizational response. Can you help us understand or just frame why during a period like this, is it important for employees why it's important for us to understand how employees feel about our response? And what are the pitfalls of not effectively monitoring employee sentiment during a period like this?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great starting question, and a great way perhaps to kind of frame the conversation we're going to have. So I think it's fair to say that it's critically important, whatever is going on within your organization, you're always going to have a level of change. So certainly as a CHRO, I was a big advocate for shifting from the very traditional annual engagement surveys that we'd be very familiar with to using a tool. In my case, it was WorkTango. You'd be maybe unsurprised to know as a way of really getting great sentiment from people around how they're feeling. And that was an organization that was going through a lot of change, a lot of transformation. So getting at that information in a very timely way, in a very accessible way was crucially important. I think that the impact of the pandemic, and then you layer onto that some of the highlighted kind of, as you point out, racial injustices that we've been experiencing over the last few weeks, make the purely amplify the need to do this more frequently and more often. I think in terms of the pitfalls, you mentioned what's the risk of not doing these things. And the big thing for me would be around, I think, is that we make assumptions without having this data. So one thing that I'm kind of very conscious of, and I've speak to a number of HR people about this, if you just think about the whole kind of return to work strategy, so they will almost put a survey out, they'll get the insight back to say that 70% of their population are keen to continue to work from home. I think there's so much nuance under that statistic that you really need to understand to really think about almost the individual situation that people are experiencing and what they're going through right now. And is that really being highlighted in that 70% response, or do you need to actually understand the sentiment in a much more detailed way? So the key thing for me would be, it's the risk of assumptions, really, I think.
I love it. Very interesting. Rob, kind of to build on that. So as business leaders, we need to know how employees are feeling, but a lot of organizations, especially younger companies, have relied on very informal methods of understanding employee sentiment. I was talking to people who literally the only mechanisms they had in place were having one-on-one conversations with people, or feeling the vibe, or having off-the-cuff conversations in the kitchen. And we know that these don't give you an accurate representation of how people feel. So can you tell us a little bit about the different methods an organization should be implementing to get real bias-free employee feedback?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with that informal feedback either, right? I think, you can institute programs and ways to start understanding sentiment of employees, but that informality and a one-on-one basis, I think is super important as well. But you think systematically as a HR leader, a business leader, trying to understand. I mean, I'm a little biased in terms of how we execute that with customers we work with, but to Mark's point about something like getting a survey or getting some level of insight, I think the approach of that is not just measuring what's happening in the organization at the moment in time, but being diagnostics about what's changing in the organization as well. So it's interesting. A lot of people think about something like a survey and they think it's an engagement measurement application, and it is, but it's way more than that. And it's, we talk about, I liken this to the world of performance management. Typically, unsuccessful performance management is just talking about the past and what you did and not thinking about developing an employee for the future. And I think that's what companies, if you're wanting to institute a way to understand more systematically how to hear the voice of employees, it's not just thinking about what your experience was, but even in this environment, well, what you think it might be to get in front of those problems. So what is your thoughts around not just remote work, getting back to work, how you're feeling? And I think if you can build that standard rhythm along with the change management and agility to understand what's happening at that moment in time, that's where you're going to see success. But I also think that if you can institute it beyond those two things and a little more specific, like focus groups, whether it's a third party or internally, now you can get deeper into a conversation and understanding recommendations. But to the original point, like, I think you still need to have those rhythm discussions as a one-on-one basis on building that. Yeah. And especially now, it's harder to have those off-the-cuff discussions or hear the voice of employees when we're not sitting in the same, rooms or buildings anymore. But that's how my head gets wrapped around, what companies could be doing or should be doing at this time.
Very interesting. So you have to be able to do both things to get a real understanding of how people feel. You should be having the informal conversations, but at the same time, you need to have some mechanisms and systems in place. You mentioned focus groups. At what size and scale do you usually suggest an organization start using focus groups to get another layer of understanding of how their people are feeling?
I mean, I think it's valuable for any size of organization. I think it's how they're executed. Typically, in my experience in conducting them or moderating them, if you have anything over 8 to 10 people, it's really challenging for everyone to have a voice there. And it's not just getting in the room and having discussion. I think the moderation is super important. But even if you're a company of 10 people, let's have a conversation about what's happening in a company and their recommendations or what's working and what isn't. Typically, the challenge is confidentiality of people not wanting to provide that feedback, which is why third parties exist.
Love it. Beth, if you think about what's going on right now, we've had this healthcare crisis that's caused an economic shutdown, which has led to mass layoffs. And during this period, people have been impacted professionally in a range of different ways. Some people have had their hours cut and their pay cut. Others have been reallocated into other jobs. There's a range of ways that this is impacting people. Some organizations during this period have really leaned into transparency. And they've shared with their employees what the financial state of the organization is and what the different scenarios they're planning for and what the operational plans of each of those scenarios look like. But others haven't. Can you help frame why it's important in a moment like this to lean into transparency? And secondly, for the HR leaders at organizations where the business leaders haven't bought into it yet, what are some tips for those HR leaders to get the business leaders to buy into this now?
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic because to start, we're talking about a point in time when many organizations are not thriving. So it's easy to be transparent when things are going well, right? So we're not thriving in many organizations. And so if we don't acknowledge this to ourselves as organizations and to our employees, first of all, we cannot commence problem solving. And so here, I'm not talking about things like simple programmed problems and easy solutions. We're talking about complex problems, right? That require novel ideas and in many cases, a real ethical expertise to help solve these problems. Because in many cases, we have some moral dilemmas that we're dealing with. You talked about layoffs and terminations, right? So really, I think leaders have been challenged by the innovation that's required to solve these problems, but it's certainly not easy. So in terms of transparency, then more specifically, first of all, I think we do need to be pragmatic. And what I mean by that is we don't need to be transparent from my lens about every single thing and at every level, because this can in fact lead to blaming. It can lead to things like mistrust and finger pointing. So an example would be, if we create a culture where we say, well, you got to CC everyone on every email, right? That actually can create a culture of mistrust. So we need to be quite balanced in terms of the kind of transparency that we are promoting. But broadly speaking, transparency during the bad times is essential. It's essential because it helps with long-term positioning and reputations for organizations. And so this is of critical importance. And so it builds and reinforces also organizational values like trust, things like integrity, and also courage for leaders, right? So it's not just morally the right thing to do, but it can be the smart thing to do as well. So to help us solve problems and then for our reputations. And so organizations in particular whose stated values align and norms align with things that are speaking to transparency, then they really have to live those values at this point in time. And organizations who may not have those stated values have an opportunity to adopt them. And I think that's really important as well. I'll say one other thing about transparency. What's really important is we need to have a culture that aligns with and has psychological safety. So when organizations are transparent and they are asking for feedback, employees need to know that it is psychologically safe to give critical and real feedback. If we don't have that in place, if it's not part of our culture, then the transparency may backfire. And so I think that's really important. And one thing I think that's really interesting, there was a study out of Duke University that asked thousands of CEOs across many companies in the US what their top priority was. And their top priority was culture. And again, culture is linked to values, which are linked to things like transparency and integrity. And they ranked culture ahead of strategic planning, operational planning, and even finance. So I think it's really, really important now more than ever.
Interesting. Very interesting.
I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I want to jump in.
Please, everyone jump in, do your thing.
It's interesting. I have the pleasure of working with a lot of organizations. I've asked to kind of sit in on some of the corporate conversations around this. So just super interested to see how people approach it. And I'd say about 50% of the time as I'm sitting back, what I'm hearing is transparency on what's happening in the company, but they're forgetting the why. So in worlds of uncertainty and not knowing what's going to happen next, just telling people what the financial numbers look like or the hiring plans, et cetera, is nice. But that just adds layers to uncertainty of what this means to the business, why those decisions are being made. So because the advice I've been giving companies is don't just give the what, give the why, but also make it a two-way conversation, right? Just talking to someone isn't really good communication, even though you're being transparent, but getting that feedback back, or, to Beth's point, the trust that it is confidential if you're going that route, or opening them forums to have those conversations, right? Vulnerability is big at this time. We're all vulnerable, right? So I think when you do those things, it kind of amplifies the ability to have better transparency and better communication in general.
I was telling back to the story, I think yesterday, where we did a webinar and there was a CRO from a Series B stage company, and he was giving this, and their company actually is doing somewhat decently during this period, but he was telling the story about how there was a moment where he had this stand-up meeting with his sales team, virtually obviously, and he broke down. He would start crying because of all the different pressures he was dealing with. And it was a moment of true vulnerability in front of his team. And it really did elevate the level of relationships he has with everyone and the overall dynamic in that team. So it's interesting to see when you're truly transparent and vulnerable to your people, how they respond. Beth, we got a question from Janet. She'd like you to just define what psychological safety means.
Sure. That's a great question, because building on what I was saying and what Rob added, employees need to feel like the communication is a two-way street. So psychological safety, very briefly, is the notion that if I'm working in an organization, I trust that if I share feedback, I trust that if I give a big idea that I'm not sure is the right idea, that I am not going to be met with extreme criticism or personal ridicule, right? So really what we need to have in organizations is trust as a value. And for me, I want to be a trusting person. But if I come into an environment where I'm ridiculed for my ideas, that would be a low psychologically safe environment. And so that two-way street is really, really important. So trust and psychological safety are similar, but they're not the exact same thing.
Got it. Very interesting.
Okay.
Mark, I'd like to talk a little bit about subconscious biases, because this is something that HR leaders and business leaders are getting asked about a lot right now, especially because of the movement for racial justice that's going on. During the hiring process, there are certain subconscious biases that play a part, and people are asking what work should be done from the HR leaders and from the business leaders to make sure that their organizations are equipping their hiring managers to not let those subconscious biases play a part in who they're hiring and how they're conducting the interview process. So can you talk a little bit about what type of training organizations should be implementing and how HR leaders can equip managers to address this concern?
Yeah, it's obviously a very topical subject at the moment. I think particularly as HR departments and leadership teams are really kind of leaning in to think about how they respond to the kind of racial injustice that we're seeing. So, and I think my kind of coping strategy in many ways is to think about the silver linings here. So a situation which has obviously been kind of tragic to kind of watch unfold in front of us in terms of some of the police brutality and the reaction to those things. I think particularly as I sit here as a very kind of privileged white middle-aged male, I think it's something that we all need to take that time to reflect on and think about how we kind of educate ourselves around some of these important topics. So that's certainly a bit of a side point, but I think an important one for us all to reflect on. Unconscious bias is a tricky subject. I think I remember when we were implementing new D&I policies within the corporate world, and it's a topic where there is some kind of controversy around to a certain extent in terms of just really questioning the value of training. So we all have biases. I think it's really just a sense of understanding how, as the term suggests, how conscious we are of those things or not. So I think certainly when it comes to recruitment, I'm not sure training certainly on its own is really the answer. If you train somebody when it comes to unconscious bias, then if you think about that, that's putting a huge amount of responsibility on the individual to really have that level of self-awareness and the ability to really think through how years, in my case, years and years of kind of education and parenting and interaction with media, etc., is really impacting their day-to-day activities. So I think that can be a lot to ask. So as an HR leader, I would encourage you to think more about the system that you have around some of these activities. And we know that from a recruitment perspective, when it comes to talent acquisition, the idea of interviewing and the fact that people will often make their mind up within the first kind of 10 seconds and then use the rest of the hour-long interview to convince themselves that their initial impression was the right one, are things that we really need to address and understand and really challenge ourselves to think differently about that. And that's not an easy thing to do. That really does involve looking at your whole system, from how you're writing your job descriptions, what behaviors your hiring leaders taking, where are roles being advertised. It's a full end-to-end review, and there's lots of quite sophisticated ways in which you can track information through those different stages to understand where your kind of hotspots are, if you like, and what actions you can then take to improve it. So I think for me, maybe in summary, the idea of unconscious bias, I think, is a lot around awareness, but I think the way of addressing that is by understanding what you have kind of systemically going on within your organization and then adapting your processes accordingly.
Very interesting. Just kind of a follow-up to that. Let's say there's somebody who says, listen, I don't feel like I have any subconscious biases. I've worked hard to educate myself, read, listen, everything, and I don't feel I have them. Can you give an example of, some type of a subconscious bias that shows itself when hiring or even having discussions around promotions and pay raises that people might not even know are within them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be many. I think it would really be a case of thinking about what would be going on for a particular individual. I mean, there's quite scary research, even if you kind of Google terminology around things like CEOs and CFOs and CTOs, that often you get coming up as images, as male images, which would influence exactly what you're kind of thinking about in terms of some of those positions. When it comes to thinking about different kind of racial groups, you may think, well, as an Asian population, that must mean they're great at math. So or maths, as I would say. So I think there's lots of biases that will come into things. And it's really a case of, I think if somebody said to me that they have no unconscious bias, that would be a kind of automatic red flag, to be honest.
Yeah, fair. Good point. We have a question.
Can I just jump in? Just to build on that, I think that's an excellent point, Mark. I think I've seen in the interview process, a lot of similarity bias, right? So the unconscious bias that when we're interviewing someone who is similar to us, we tend to be more favorably inclined towards them. And that's one of several reasons why, I think that, having a hiring committee is really important, and having a group decision for many positions, particularly acknowledging that a diverse group of decision makers is important, because that is one. And I think, Mark, you made an excellent point. Anyone who says that they have no unconscious biases, like, that's a very concerning comment, because we all have them. And the first step is acknowledging that we have them.
Yeah, I agree. Very good point.
The one
Rob.
thing I want to add there is that, changing that process from end to end is usually a challenging process. But what I've seen companies do is take advantage of this time where many companies are not hiring or have halted it, to take that opportunity to do so. So I think from a timing perspective, if someone was thinking of really looking at it from top to bottom, this might be the right time, especially with, folks in the talent acquisition world, potentially doing less than they were before.
I think it's a really good point, Rob, and I think in some ways that again provides us with an opportunity. I think that the fact that lots of these processes are kind of moving online, I think there's an argument there that might increase the inclusivity with which you can then think about those situations. But then you also have to address the point you just made, Beth, about exactly how are you going to get those people on board? How do you do diverse panels and groups, etc., and everyone is virtual? Work samples and getting people actually to do activities is a great way of ensuring that those processes don't have any kind of built-in bias to them. So are they easy to shift some of these experiences online so that they are much more impactful and accessible to people? So there's lots of considerations, but it's kind of a different point away, but I think it's a great time for us to kind of essentially just reimagine work in many respects and just think differently about all these concepts.
For sure. This is an interesting time because yes, like people are very busy trying to stabilize their businesses and do a lot of things, but at the same time, if let's say there's an organization whose revenue stream pipeline of new business has been halted to some extent, or deals are not closing, you do have a little bit more time to look at your business from a macro perspective and say, okay, what are the areas where we need to address? And it's good to see that some companies are doing that. Rob, we have a question here that Joe Smith has, which is that what recommendations do you have when somebody gives an organization critical feedback, but then they ignore it either consciously or unconsciously? What advice do you give that person who gave that feedback and now feels that they're not being heard?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, obviously, this is what we do with a lot of companies, is get feedback from employees, typically in a survey format. And one of the things that we started instituting into our kind of model are even questions around that exact concept. Do you believe that action is going to take place from your feedback, or has it? And when you start throwing that in front of an executive team, that your employees feel no confidence you're going to do anything with this feedback, that's usually a good way to measure that. Right? Walking into an HR room and saying, someone said this, and it's hearsay, is different than saying, these are what employees feel. So I found those are really important questions to ask in terms of that process. Sometimes it's just a hard conversation, right? Like, if we are going to lose trust in our employees if we're not acting on this, or tell them at least why we're not acting. And I think that's where usually the biggest gap is. What we do is we don't do anything, but we don't tell people the why, like I was mentioning earlier. And sometimes people, again, if they understand it, they may not like it, but at least they understand why the decision was made. So I find there's a couple of tactics there to kind of help from that perspective. I had another point, but I can't remember it now, so I'm going to let someone else chime in.
All right. I have another audience question here. So Beth, maybe you can help us with this. Laurel Anderson, if I butchered your name, I apologize. She says that I've always thought the hardest part about being a parent is being a good example. This seems to be true for HR people as well. Could you give a little checklist of what items would be considered a good example to show to staff?
In general, or around?
Yeah, I think as an organization, what type of behaviors or actions should an HR team be doing to set a really good example for the other business leaders and divisions to learn from?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I'll try to highlight a few things. I mean, modeling is the most powerful for sure. So I think that, we need to walk the talk as HR professionals. If we're talking about things like biases in particular, and we are doing training, or we are working through educating ourselves about our own biases, to be open about that process is really important. So to share, and that takes some vulnerability, right? But that is important for leaders across all career streams. So I think it's walking the talk. I think it's being vulnerable and talking about, and this is important as a coach as well, talking about the areas where as an HR professional, we may struggle, the biases that perhaps we came into our career with, how we overcame those biases, how we have worked to become as HR professionals more self-aware across all levels of management. And in HR, I think in particular, we need to constantly build personal insight. So if we can be vulnerable and talk about our own imperfections, talk about how we have struggled, then that is, I think, first of all, it's an important point in terms of, or starting point in terms of building credibility. And it is modeling the behavior that we want to extend across the organization. So I think that's a good starting point. And there's probably lots of other things. Yeah.
I like the way that you framed it, right? Like, think about your organization. What values do you want to put forward as an organization that you feel are important for your people to follow, and then create behaviors around those? Mark, we have a question from Mariah, which I think is a really important question right now. Organization, which is around how HR leaders can help the leadership team of the organization with employee engagement during this period. It's a good question because it's such a hard time to keep people engaged. They're either working longer and harder than they've ever done before with less positive reinforcement of their actions, or they're seeing, revenues drop and jobs being, layoffs happening, etc. In both of those cases, employees can feel a little bit disengaged. How do you address engagement in an environment like this?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and there's no silver bullet, I'm afraid, that's going to require a whole range of different tactics and different approaches. But I think for me, it's really kind of understanding the kind of starting point and having a real appreciation for the fact that people are going to be responding to this situation in a very individual way, and going back to the earlier question, being careful, not as an organization, but also as individual leaders, not to make any assumptions. So I think some of the qualities that Beth just articulated, which really resonated with me, kind of extend into this question in many respects. So you want to make sure that your organization's being compassionate, and your organization is really listening to kind of understand what's going on with people. We'd have heard the phrase that it's a time now for all of us to be a new kind of CEO, a chief empathy officer, which was a phrase that I really liked. And I think if we've demonstrated that we can bring that empathy into organizations. I just hope that that's one of the silver linings of this situation, that's the sort of thing that continues beyond this time. So I think from an engagement perspective, it's about really understanding, back to kind of sentiment, understanding what your people are looking for and finding different ways of delivering that. So, I've seen some really cool things that organizations are doing with Zoom to kind of engage with people in a different way and ensure that they're still being able to provide some of that social connection, which we know is really important for us as human beings. Kind of big quizzes that people are doing, or a kind of an opportunity just to connect with people. So I think that sort of thing's important, right through to the kind of transparent communications, the regular updates, having CEOs sat in their home and demonstrating a level of real openness and transparency. As my future forward friend Naomi says, there's lots of things that we've seen that we're not going to be able to unsee. So I think just being able to bring all of that openness to people are things that we then have to bring back as we do start to slowly open up. So lots of activities. For me, at the end of the day, it's about equipping the individual leaders that, we know they're the people who are going to have the biggest impact on your engagement. So equipping those individual leaders to make sure they're prepared to really support their leaders and to support their team, in the right way. So.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
I'm smiling because for the last about 2-3 months, I've been doing a talk just around what are 4 key things you need to do to engage employees in these uncertain times. And I think Mark just named them all off, just ad hoc. But like literally the 4 was open communication, all the things we just talked about transparency. The second one was adapt, but don't change your engagement strategies today. So you might be doing things as a rhythm or something in your organization where you just don't stop doing it, maybe just adapt it based on an online world or another way that you can interact with people in that way. And also add something on that's more purposeful. So maybe that, you might not be able to create masks and things like that in your organization, but maybe you're a small company and your parking lot is near a healthcare institution. You can give that to people for free. So there's different ways you can be purposeful in trying to help what's going on around you. The third was, I like to say, change the concept of engagement just to well-being as well. Because right now, everyone's getting attacked at all layers of wellness, physical, social, financial, right? Mental. And I think if you can have that empathy or even do empathy training with leaders, I think it's a really important way to dive through this time. And then the last one was, this isn't an HR strategy. This is a leadership strategy. So to Mark's point, like if you can enable your leaders and make sure that they're part of this process, they're going to be required in order to have, to continue to build engagement in the company. So, was kind of repeating a bit what Mark said, but just giving a lot of thought to what those items are. That's what I've been recommending to a lot of companies as well.
Yeah, I think the really, that's a great list, Rob. I think the encouraging thing there is for me that if you don't have one of those elements, one of those pillars almost of the four things that Rob just articulated so clearly, then there's nothing stopping you from creating it. So there's this thing about how you leverage the crisis in a very productive way. But if through this process you've got much more clarity around the fact that your purpose isn't clear, then create a purpose. And you can, the opportunity to kind of co-create with people at this time where everyone has been through this whole situation together. It's one of the few things that we've all experienced together, regardless of race, gender, where we are in the hierarchy, provides a really strong kind of stepping off point, I think, for me about how organizations can think about this differently. And I think eyes are on organizations at this time to think about how they respond. And so the ones that really kind of seize this opportunity are going to be the ones that are going to thrive in the future, for sure.
It's our defining moment, right?
Yeah,
for sure. If you think about a lot of the early stage tech companies that were leaning into this, creating an employer brand that was around the perks of working for the organization versus the purpose. A lot of companies went down that path, and then a few started taking the purpose-driven approach. And the quality of people that they were hiring was different. Great talent wants to work for an organization where they connect with the purpose of the organization. Their retention rates were higher. Their engagement rates were higher. Their performance rates were higher. So if that's one of the positives that comes out of this, that companies become more purpose-driven, that would be a very big positive. Sure. Beth, I'd like to talk a little bit about how COVID is going to change the job of a manager for the organizations that are going to embrace working from home, either fully or partly. If companies like Shopify and Twitter have gone completely virtual, and then there's some companies that are taking a hybrid approach, it does, change what we need from our managers, what their day-to-day looks like. So can you tell us a little bit about what that change might look like, and then how HR leaders can equip these managers for success?
It's a great question. I don't know with certainty, but I do have some predictions because we've seen, things change over the last 10 or 11 weeks that are really interesting. First of all, I think that we're seeing a lack of role clarity between work and home. That's happened, that will continue to happen. So roles are more ambiguous and boundaries therefore are blurred. Individuals have limited time and ability to transition from work and home and work to personal time. And so managers have more distractions, and this is going to continue. Inequities are also surfacing, right? Because not every manager has the same work setup at home, right? And so that will create some challenges as well. So I think that's one that we've seen. Relational challenges, not only relational challenges within one's home, right? But that does exist, and we've seen that as well. But also relational challenges as a result of lack of face time that managers have with their teams. And so the ability to build relationships and the ability to understand context, for example, if we've been working as a team in the office and we're having a difficult time solving a complex problem, if my colleague emails me later in the day with a really grumpy or curt note, I have context and I understand. So there's a challenge around relational attunement when we are working remotely.
Very good point.
And so it's really challenging to build that attunement, certainly to build a new team. If we think about the stages of team development, the norming and the storming, right? Hard to get to know people who are new, hard to build that team cohesion. It's difficult also to understand, stress behaviors because we're not actually seeing them throughout the day. And we are seeing more stress behaviors. I love what Rob said about empathy. I think empathy is so important right now. We are seeing individuals' needs not being met on an ongoing basis. And when needs are not met on an ongoing basis, we see more stress behaviors. When we see stress behaviors, we can't necessarily know what needs are or what interests are, the motivators of employees, unless they tell us, right? So we're making sometimes the wrong inferences often. And it's not because we're not smart or it's not because we don't care, but we just don't know. So stress behaviors, I think, will increase, and that's really important. Increased potential around isolation. relational isolation, but individuals who are working alone may feel more isolated. And that's challenging around creating a sense of belonging for teams, that collective belonging, which is very important. The other thing that I think managers are going to have a hard time with is with respect to communicating expectations and norms for the team, right? So I think that's really important. And then finally, I think checking in on employee well-being and the emotional well-being of the team. So what can we do? I think that there are a couple of things we can do. I think we have to ask, we have to be listening, and we have to have a deliberate plan to engage in more conversations about employee well-being. And we can't presume to know. So it's really, really important that we are listening. I think HR managers and HR support functions in organizations need to make sure that individuals have a proper setup at home. And that might seem elementary, but if I don't have a proper desk and a proper chair in a private workspace, then I cannot work effectively. So that is really important as well. We have to invest additional resources, I believe, in terms of manager training and development and coaching. So for all of these challenges that I mentioned, we need to provide support to our managers to increase their level of self-awareness so that they can be a little bit more attuned to the challenges in their team. And so that is very important that organizations invest in their managers, because the job of a manager right now is very, very challenging, and it will increase. And so that's, building self-awareness, building psychological capital, helping increase abilities around emotional intelligence, all of those competencies that are not specific to jobs, I think we really need to focus on. And then we really need to maybe create a community. So if I'm in a small company and I only have a couple managers, can I create a community of other managers so that we can learn from each other, so that we can have empathy? Because we're all, we're experiencing a lot of similar experiences. And so I think creating different kinds of communities for managers will be really, really important.
Very interesting. Yes. It does, from my conversations with people who are in management roles right now, they've already felt that it's quite different to what it used to be. And the cadence of how they manage their teams, the teams aren't around them anymore. So you have to have more one-on-one conversations. It almost means that you might be able to manage less people if you want to do it effectively. The type of conversations and challenges are totally different. So it is, managers are going to see a lot change in this new world. Rob, we have a question here from Romania. It's a very good question. So as we start to call people back to work on site, how much choice should we give the individual over whether they should come back, especially if the organization's point of view is that we are better when we're together on site?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one. Because I have the luxury of sitting on a lot of data of what employees are saying around this topic, and two major ones. One is their desire to go back to work, and as opposed to working remotely. And we're into kind of the low teens when it comes to people that actually want to get back into the office versus either staying in or doing more hybrid type approach. The second, I guess, more interesting stat on that, and on a single digit percentage, people think that they're actually less productive at home. So now you're seeing a huge influx of people to think their productivity is the same or better than losing it. So my advice on this, to be honest, is there's no need to be first to market on this. Like, let's kind of see how other companies how they go through this process in terms of letting people back to work, seeing what some of the issues that come up. And this was kind of what we were talking about earlier about feedback. Like, we don't even know some of the situations that might come up. Like, some people are like, it's not just us, it's the other 30, offices in our building, and elevators and childcare, and how to go to the washroom and all this other stuff. So I think it's a huge thing. But more specific to that question, I believe that we're going to be in a kind of economy of choice, right? Today, as a consumer, you get choice to do whatever you want, however you want, structure it. And if you don't offer people that level of flexibility, they will find it elsewhere. Like, I don't think we're kidding ourselves to say that the workplace is going to change in terms of people going to more hoteling or working remotely, as you're seeing with a lot of those large companies. I mean, even in Toronto, the big Deloitte building, I mean, they've been doing that for years. And I just think that if you don't give them choice, you may lose fantastic talent, and actually not even open yourself up to other talent that's not sitting in your office. So I think the point of view might be there, but I think it's a really good conversation about what are the pros and cons? Like, what's the essence of that point of view of having people together? Is it on a social basis? Well, maybe they can do that 2 times a week. So I don't have any real concrete answers. It's more kind of food for thought on going through the process, because a lot of us are going through this right now. Like, we shut down our 2 offices. Now I'm like, what are we going to do now? Like, I'm thinking the same thing. But those are my mindset on
I think
how to approach
one
it.
of the it's to kind of piggyback on what we were talking about a bit earlier. This is where I think HR leaders need to provide some training to managers, because managers might be saying, hey, I'm really super excited to get back into the office, and be kind of taking that point of view that let's get back in soon. And that people will feel pressure to come in, and managers shouldn't be doing that. Like, everybody should take a second and take it a little bit easier. Mark, I have a question that's from the sales world, and I've been asked to specifically ask this question today from you guys. We are hearing a lot about how enablement is going to play a very big role in this new world, where virtual selling is a norm, as well as the buyers are a lot more conservative than ever before. So it'd be an interesting thought exercise to get your feedback on who enablement should actually report into, because right now it reports into the revenue leader. Is there a reason for the enablement function to report into HR? Could it be better if it did? Or at least should there be a lot more collaboration between those 2 divisions? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, I think it's a very kind of specific question. As I said, I'm not sure my answer is going to be very helpful, because I think in some ways it depends. I think it depends on kind of the individual situation and what's going on. So certainly, as a former leader of relatively big HR teams, we would have always had a big relationship with the sales team, certainly when it came to sales incentives in particular, and making sure that there's strong synergies there. I think that the question I would probably answer, and maybe it's reflective of the audience we have today, I think answer it more from the HR perspective of really understanding what it is that as an HR team you should be focusing on. And if one of the priorities is around making sure that the sales enablement process is done in an appropriate way, and there's not too many kind of handoffs between different functions, and maybe it provides you a division between church and state in some respects, then I think it's potentially a good decision. But you shouldn't lose sight of what you're there to do as an HR function at the end of the day. And I think that's where we've spent our time today talking about some of those things in terms of how HR can play a role in really role modeling the right behaviors in the organization, driving the right change, ensuring the right level of transparent communication. So I'd be wary of taking on things which are perhaps going to distract you from what I think is a really important agenda there. But I think it's also an opportunity with some of those things to think about what process can be automated. So I think increasingly where we're being asked to do more with less, is this an opportunity to think about opportunities for efficiency there as well, rather than layering something into what is likely to be an already busy HR team.
Yeah,
this is where I demonstrate my very conscious bias around HR and protecting HR from kind of doing a load of things they perhaps shouldn't be doing.
It's similar to governments, right? Like the centralized, decentralized model, where there's some things that should be centralized and some things that should be decentralized. They'd be better if they are. And
things go through cycles, don't they? And they, sometimes where you want to get your arms around something and make sure that things are being done in a very consistent way, it makes sense to centralize, and then you find yourself going through that cycle of then decentralizing it. That's the rhythm of business, I sometimes think.
Makes sense. Beth, let's talk a little bit about mental health. It's obviously been a concern for many, many years, and some good work has been done in that area. A lot more still needs to be done. I want to talk a little bit about a component of it that I think is somewhat neglected, which is the mental health of the leadership team. Being a leader in an organization, especially when the company is going through a period like this, can be very stressful, right? You're dealing with the existential threat to your organization, having to do mass layoffs, seeing revenues drop, clients leave, things of that nature. In an environment like this, what type of work should HR teams be doing to make sure that there's a system or infrastructure there to support the leadership team from a mental health perspective?
It's an excellent question. And I think that certainly HR has a role to play, but the culture in the organization and the leader, him or herself, has a role to play as well. So I think it starts, first of all, with with building self-awareness in leaders. And so, and that may come from getting advice from HR leaders that executives would benefit from building leader self-awareness. And what I mean by that is, better understanding one's personality. So, there are many kinds of really good, valid, and reliable psychometric tests that can help individuals build personal insight and self-awareness. And I think that has to be the first step. It has to be the first step because if we don't know ourselves, then we don't know what our set point is or our benchmark is. And we cannot ask for help because we don't even know what the help is that we need. So I think that's a really important starting point. And now then we might ask, well, how do we get started, right? I mean, we need leaders and executives and HR leaders to step up and model excellence in this particular sphere. And so what I mean by that is, we need individuals to be open about their own struggles, right? That ripple effect will be really, really important. When Michael Wilson, the former finance minister who has since passed away, started talking about mental health and the loss of his son who died by suicide, it was a seminal moment for society because he was so open about his family experience. And I think there was a tremendously positive ripple effect in terms of having conversations about mental health, and in that case, suicide. So we need individuals to step up and be vulnerable. And I think that's really, really important. So HR needs to therefore educate themselves on, not just the data and the metrics around mental health and disabilities, but they have to be able to communicate that therefore to their leaders. And so I think it's around self-awareness for leaders, and it's around education. And then reminding our leaders that their own modeling is very powerful. If they can be vulnerable, they can set a standard of excellence for everyone in their organization, and that becomes embedded into culture, and that creates positive behaviors in their organization.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I always wonder, like, will there be some leaders who will find it unsafe to be that vulnerable to even their HR partners and other leaders in the organization, because it could give somebody some type of leverage against them. Like, there's always that subconscious fear around that. Like, will they always just prefer going to a third party? Will they do something internally? Who knows?
I think there's, of course, 100%.
Yeah.
I think there's a tremendous risk. There is a risk. And so I think in some ways what I'm suggesting is, it sounds easier than perhaps it is. There's a tremendous risk, but there's also an opportunity for leaders to demonstrate tremendous courage in being vulnerable in this particular regard.
Agreed. We are at our last minute. So Rob, I have my last question for you. One of the positives that we've noticed through all of this is that there have been some organizations that have reallocated staff into different roles where they need them. A very simple example is about 50% of companies, 52% have reallocated staff into their customer success team because they realized they were understaffed and they needed more resources. It has led to employees coming back with feedback that we really like this. We've learned so much. It'll make us better at our original job. We've grown, we've learned, our business acumen's evolved. And so do you think in this post-COVID world, organizations will lean into having more rotational programs to help develop their employees and help them be more engaged? Or is that something that we'll traditionally only see at the RBCs and the Shells of the world? Oh,
sorry, I was on mute. So I think it's happening in organizations. And I think the dust is first going to settle because in a lot of cases, we're asking employees to do a lot more with less, right? To probably do their current role as well as step in and help in other parts of the organization. So I think once that dust settles, I think in theory, it's a great idea, but I think there's two really important things to think about. One is, first off, is there an appetite for employees to do these types of things, depending on your organization, industry, things that they can actually do rotational programs in, and understanding that whether there is an interest, I think is the first step. The second is, what is the intention of doing this? Now, the intention of skill building might be the intention and the right one, and that gives an opportunity for someone to do those things. But what is the future? Is it actually moving into other parts of the organization? Will there be internal applications for things? Like, is it actually going to lead to new job opportunities or not? And I think being really clear what's communicated to employees. So I think the opportunity is there, and I think it lends itself to say, hey, we tried it, we were forced to. We're understanding there might be a positivity here. We're going to do it, but this is the outcome we're going to see. So without identifying what success looks like to the company, I think it'll be hard to be successful. But if you have that intention, then commit to employees you're going to do that and think about how we're going to backfill those positions. But I've always been a big fan of allowing people to, learn something new or get access to the rest of the organization. They just become more kind of holistic in terms of understanding how it runs. And so I like it, but I think it's bigger than just running a rotational program.
Yeah, it reminds you what the process of getting good at something is when you're put into a thing that is different to what your normal job was. You're like, oh, these are the steps it takes to get good and then become great. Okay, we are out of time. Mark, Beth, Rob, thank you to all three of you for joining us and doing this. Rob for actually helping put all of this together, and for the audience for joining us and taking part. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.